Hi, Steve Cassidy here. I'm going to talk today about the history of the World Wide Web, part one at least, and let's look at the early history of what would become the World Wide Web. The early history starts way back in the 1960s when the Americans needed a way to communicate between different machines that they were deploying in different universities, university research labs. And the reasons were that these machines were very expensive. These computers were some of the early computers, very expensive, and so they wanted to make sure that people from different places could make use of them. So they started looking at the idea of a network between these things that would connect up these different sites so that people from one site could make use of the computers on the other side. And it was purely a defense organized network and designed for researchers that were working on these defense projects funded by this thing called ARPANET, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. You can see here one of the original modems, essentially, the Infinite Interface Message Processor, or IMP, the size of a big fridge, was the thing that actually connected a computer to the communications network, to the telephone system, to actually exchange data. And in 1969 then, the first of these networks was put in place, and this was a 4-node network commissioned by ARPANET. It connected 3 universities and 1 research center. And this was essentially the layout of the internet at that time. Well, it wasn't the internet by then, this was just a network, the ARPANET. And the primary use, so these things were connected up, and as I said, they were all about trying to allow people to make use of resources on at other sites. But as it turned out, the primary use that this network had was email. Text-based email was how they started to use these systems. So that was a sort of a bit of a sideways step, not what was intended or planned for this usage, but that's what became the most interesting part of it. Fast forward just a little bit to 1972, and again, electronic mail between these sites is the most popular, is the biggest user of bandwidth. And they're developing mail systems, ways to exchange emails with each other. Because of course there weren't any ways of doing that in the past, so they were inventing the protocols for doing so. And you had to work out who an email message was going to go to. And so this chap called Ray Tomlinson from BBN Labs, one of the private contractors in this network, suggests that they use the @ sign as part of an email address, so name of a person at a particular machine. Now remember, there weren't very many machines on the network at this time, so the number of things on the right hand side of the @ was fairly small, but that was used first in 1972. In 1973 you started to see some international connections to the ARPANET. So rather than just being, and during this time the number of computers that were connected to the network increased slowly, but you started to see some international connections. Now this was using the telephone network to actually make the connection, and these IMP processors to do the sort of digitalization of the signals. But we started to see some international connections in 73, and the idea of the thing called the Ethernet was sort of coming into place at that time. And again, in 1973, the beginnings of what was called internetworking research started to take place. And internetworking research was the idea of connecting different networks together. So the ARPANET was one network, and some other networks were starting to be thought about in other places. And so one question was, how do you get email, for example, or traffic from one network to another? In 1975, again on the theme of email, the first mailing list called Message Group was set up, where you could send an email and it would actually go to a number of different recipients. So that was 1975. In 1979, we get another momentous bit of creativity when Kevin McKenzie suggests that in order to show emotion in email, this is this new text-based medium that people were discovering, they end an email or use the bracket, or no, the minus bracket sign there with as a sort of a smile, and then Scott Farman suggests the colon to add some eyes into that, and a smile and a frown, and we get the beginnings of the smiley and the first emoticon. So 1979 is the history of emoticons goes back to another great year in the history of the internet. By 1982, or the 80s to 82, we're starting to see other networks being established. And so we see things like BitNet, CSNet, EUNet, so in the European Union, in Europe, in South America, in Canada, and so on. These other networks start to be established using the same basic ideas as ARPANET, some of the same technology as ARPANET, but separate networks that were not interconnected. And so in the early 80s, then we start to see this thing where we connect these networks together, and this becomes the internet. So if you're looking for the birth of the internet, we look to 1980 to 82, where these networks started being joined together. And in the picture here, you see a picture of the interconnectedness of the networks that are around the world at that time. In 83, we see the advance of the TCP/IP protocol. TCP/IP is the low-level protocol that is still used today to transfer digital packets across the network. So in 1983, that becomes the standard way of transferring data, and that standardization on TCP/IP was a huge step towards enabling this thing called the internet, because if everybody uses the same protocol for exchanging packets of data, then obviously they can make it easy to actually connect one to another. And in 1983, we also have the invention of this thing called the name service, where instead of using numbers, so you can see on this picture here, we have these numbers 10.3.0.51. These are the IP numbers of these machines. Instead of having to use those to refer to machines, we can use a name like google.com, although that didn't exist anywhere near that time. And that would then be translated by the DNS system into a number, again making this thing much more easy to use. So in 1983, we're starting to see the beginnings of the internet. For a local twist, then in 1983, this chap here was in power. This is Bob Hawke, and Australia was connected to the internet for the first time. Now, the Australian connection to the internet consisted of a dial-up modem from Darwin to the University of California at Berkeley. And so they would essentially call them on the phone, hook up the modem, and download various bits of things. So they would download, and this protocol called UUCP for the Unix to Unix copy protocol was the way of transferring news articles. So the very early days of transferring news around the world is UUCP. So they would phone up the University of California, download a whole chunk of stuff, and then that could be distributed around Australia to different places using this protocol. So this was the very first connection of Australia to the internet. 1989, all of the different Australian universities got together and formed this thing called AARNet, the Australian Academic Research Network. And remember, at this time, the internet was essentially a research university academic network. There were no such thing as commercial providers on there, that except the ones that were involved in research. So some defense research establishments were on the internet, but no commercial organizations really were on the internet at all in any capacity at this time. So this is a purely academic network used for research, for exchanging information between researchers and sharing resources between people. We also in 1989 had this first permanent connection establishing a link between the ARNet and ARPANET, and that was a 2,400 bits per second link, again a telephone link between Melbourne and the University of Hawaii. So 2,400 bits per second for all of Australia to link to the internet. So it's not just one person, that's everybody in Australia who uses the internet. So needless to say, it wasn't very quick moving data around at that time, moving anything around. So if you really wanted to transfer some files from the US to here, it was actually much faster to get on a plane, go and pick up a tape and bring it back than it was to actually do something on the internet at that time. But again, it was really useful for email and simple file transfers like that. 1988 saw some changes in the internet and the advent of this thing called the Morris Internet Worm. At that time there were around 60,000 hosts on the internet, 60,000 machines, computers connected to the internet, and this chap Morris created this thing called a worm, which is a self-replicating program. It would run on one of these internet nodes and find places that this thing was connected to. It would exploit a weakness in the Unix software to allow itself to connect to this other machine and install itself on the other machine, where it would then run and do the same thing. And what he was interested in doing was seeing how big the internet was, how many hosts there were. But he had sort of various things in the software to limit what it would do and how many times it would copy itself, but he coded it incorrectly, and it estimated to get to 6,000 of the 60,000 machines on the internet and dragged it, the traffic to a standstill. The damages were estimated to be $100,000 to $10 million, and it really prompted the establishment of this computer emergency response team, which was sort of like the repair team for the internet. But really this is the very first, and it wasn't a malicious use of this kind of technology, but the first worm and sort of virus, if you like, to get into the system. So I'll leave it there. That really brings us up to the dawn of the age of the World Wide Web, which was invented a couple of years after this. That just shows you the early history of the internet, the way it was put together, and how it developed leading up to the development of the web.